Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Environmental Podcast.
Yeah, this is our podcast where we choose an aspect of sustainability and we deep dive into it every month.
hmm And over the past, I guess, month and a half, we've really been diving into, we decided to go a little bit longer on this one because we're talking about food and agriculture, how agriculture and culture intersect. We also
Yeah,
talked about food insecurity, food deserts, and um,
food waste and we've
food
talked
tech.
and
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a, an interesting switch a little bit because this week we read a book called Black Food Matters. I never have the authors' names
oh, I got it.
on me at the time.
Ashanté M, Reese and
Yes.
Hanna Garth. But it's actually a compilation of a lot of different articles from sociologists and people in the social science world, um, and it's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really cool. So, and it's a hefty topic, so we decided to split it up into two parts. So, we'll be talking about this topic over the course of this week and our next episode coming out next week.
Yep, and I will go first with the first half of the book. We'll split it up. I like these the when we split when we get to share what we learn.
Yeah.
It's cool. Um, so I read the first half of the book, and it is you said it right. This is a heavy topic. There is a ton to learn about and a ton to think about. Um, and I don't really know where to start. I wrote down a lot of thoughts, but I think I'll start with maybe the names of the chapters and their authors, because they all have different authors and it's different topics. So,
Okay.
um,
Yeah.
it's chapters or articles, but in the food justice world, but not of it. Everyday Black Food Entrepreneurship by Ashanté M. Reese. The second one is The Intersection of Politics and Food Security in a South Carolina Town by Gillian Richards-Greaves. The third is Nurturing the Revolution, the Black Panther Party and the Early Seeds of Food Justice Movement by Analena Hope Hassberg. I hope I said that right. The fourth is Blackness and Justice in the Los Angeles Food Justice Movement by Hanna Garth. And I also listened to Good Food in a Racist System, Competing Moral Economies in Detroit by Andrew Newman and Yusin Young. And did you also read that one?
I don't think so.
It's, yeah, they're always based on tracks. So, like, it's track 6 out of 12, I think.
Mine started at soul food gentrification. Yeah, so
Okay.
that's the next one. Yeah, so
Awesome.
it was quite different, and that's really why we split this up because there were so many like subsections of this book
Yep.
that all of them really are fascinating topics that could in and of itself have a solo
Yeah.
podcast all about them.
They
But
each chapter could have really been its own podcast. I mean, its own
mhm.
article. These are long articles and they're so intentional and so well thought out. I think I would highly recommend this book um, to anybody that wants to do the work, um, because this does touch on a lot of it's not a conceptual racism book. Like it's not like it is here's how systematic racism has affected the Black community over the past 50 plus years, and here are potential solutions for it. Whereas a lot of times you read a lot about like systemic racism and classism and sexism. And I think you read a lot about it. A lot of it feels conceptual because isms are emotional reactions that people have to the other. But this is such an incredible documentation of like, here's the shit that happens. Like, and it's
it's like a history book in a way.
in a way, yeah, it is the correct history that like they don't want you to know. That's
This is what's left out of the history books.
Super what's left out. So yeah, we kind of decided that rather than like going topic to topic, we would split it up and sort of give thoughts and interest in like how it all wraps together, which I think was a good choice because there's so much to consider and it is so deep. And I kept coming back to this idea about like removing this white-centric focal point or this plan and the definitions of what is healthy, like this is healthy and this is what they need would happen. That's kind of this conversation where on a consistent basis, white folks or like more affluent folks are like, this is what they need in the poor Black communities. And this dialogue feels really separatist, and it's born out of really from the same supremacy that caused the food insecurity to begin with and continues to cause it today.
Mm-hmm.
And I really loved that this book focused, like kind of removed that conversation entirely, like pointed to it directly, and then was also like, yeah, like this doesn't help. Here's some things that do help.
Okay, interesting.
So, and I'm like, there are real issues to food access, but it doesn't. So I'm not saying that, but I am saying that it doesn't help to just like give solutions without understanding the complexity of the issue, and which is wrapped up in like everything. But the chapter about the Black Panthers, which I think was the third article in the book, is really inspiring because in history they see the Black Panthers as super violent, and I find that ironic in today's climate because they were originally thought that way because they marched with weapons to stand up for the Second Amendment right. Like, I'm not going to go into the cultural implications there. I think we can just set that down. But they're an activist group for sure, but actually they are a program and a group that empowers Black voices. And they built these really incredible survival programs, which they call them. And the one they talk about a lot in this is the breakfast program, which federal breakfast programs are still based on today, including the school that I went to and had free breakfast programs. I had no idea, but it's when they were explaining it, I was like, I went to a school like that had this exact same program. And something that she said in this article is hungry kids can't pay attention in school, which you talked about 2 weeks ago. But they made it bigger. Hungry communities can't organize. Yeah. The Black Panther Party actively they were reframing things like food, healthcare, living wages, like access to clean water as rights. And that scares the government because they created a politically charged, educated Black population, which is terrifying
to them,
for our government.
To those in power. Yeah.
Those in power. Mm-hmm. So like hungry, poor communities aren't accidental. And the groups of people that talk about or want to solve root issues like the lack of healthy food access actually solve the root issue rather than just throwing food at the problem, or healthcare, or not making a living wage, or clean water, or systemic racism, or intergenerational poverty. They're treated like they're violent, and they get crazy freaking propaganda talked about them. Like, look at BLM right now.
It's the
Like,
same
it's
method
it's the same
used
method.
to make them seem so violent, to vilify that group in any way, shape, or form. Yeah.
Yep. And that's what happened with the Black Panther Party. And it's a damn shame because they did really, really good work to empower this community and offer food sovereignty, which is like totally different than like just giving access to food. And like and there's a lot about food sovereignty in this book, because I mean, that's what it's about. It's not about like solving the food access issue. There's even a part in the last book, actually the last chapter is that I read is very, very interesting because it talks to people in Detroit about their access to food and how they feel about it. And they don't ever really talk about how far they have to go. It's just like part of their life. Like the access part isn't really a problem for them. They're just sort of like politically charged. They're about like, oh yeah, this grocery store, if I go, like into the suburbs, if I want to get good meat, and this grocery store has cheap canned food, but you got to watch the label. Like, it's just as political of a conversation as it is if you're like, no matter where you live, which grocery store has the best food, has the safest food, rather than being like, I just can't get to the grocery store. Like, that's not that didn't come up in their conversation with the people that they interviewed in Detroit, which I think is really interesting because as a sociologist or as an interdisciplinary like scholar, somebody studying this, people are like concerned about access and how to get to the grocery store and how people are going to, but that's not part of the culture and it never has been. So it's one of those, I think that if a grocery store was placed somewhere and it was thriving and then it was removed, it would be a lot different of a story, but it's never been there. So this group of these poor communities, like it's just part of their life that they have to go over there to get to the grocery store, if that makes any sense.
Interesting. I mean, perhaps that I did look at that chapter as well, because I have some notes about Detroit too, unless mine also started with Detroit, but
more than one.
I thought that they did mention that like 1 in 5 urban residents didn't have cars.
But it's still like part of their culture, just part of their life that they have to travel to if they want to get.
Okay. It's become normalized that, they have to do it. Yeah, it's not, they don't think, I mean, sure.
I just find that interesting.
Yeah.
I find it like we're concerned about like getting a grocery store over there, like from a place of like interdisciplinary study and from research point of view. It's like, how do we get food into this neighborhood and how do we make sure that it's healthy food and questions like that. But when you actually talk to somebody on the ground, that isn't what comes up for them.
Mhm.
they'll just say that's where the good meat is. That's, you have to go a ways, but that's where
Right.
it's at. It costs a little more. Like it's a normalized thing,
Mhm.
which, yeah, I find that
That makes
really,
sense. I mean, it doesn't make a difference really if you have to go a mile and a half or if you have to go 2 or 3 miles down the
right,
road, like they'll still, I mean, that's just the way it's been.
right. That's the way it's always been. And when that's the way it's always been in a culture that is like, we make ways where there is no ways,
Yeah.
that statement was said a lot throughout this, then it seems less of an emergency to need to put a grocery store there. This is an adaptive culture. I find it, that's where where I come back to the idea of like this white centric, we have to solve this problem. But like, there are folks that live in a different culture that are, it's a separatist idea. They have ways, they've been feeding themselves for this long. Not saying that there isn't a problem, because there is a food access problem, absolutely. But it isn't something to pity.
No.
It's a, and I love the way that and oftentimes I think that from a place of privilege, it does come off as we have to solve this problem. And it does come off as like, oh, poor pity. But
Hmm.
I don't, I think that reframing that as just, empowering people, feeding people in the way that the Black Panthers like really spoke on it, is something that is an important shift to make, like into this sovereignty idea and into this like empowering a group, educating and creating a politically charged population that cares. Um, and food justice is one way of doing that, because, yeah, hungry people can organize, as they said.
Hungry people can't organize.
Hungry
Yeah.
people can't organize. Yeah, fed people can organize. That's what I mean. And yeah,
Interesting. I mean, and like, it's an interesting thought that, I mean, of course, yes, there is always this kind of thing, this like, white savior complex. Um, but to some extent, as you mentioned, like the food inequality isn't an accident.
no,
So working to try to solve that, like that's the issue that I think that white voices can and should be trying to like address, rather than like, yeah, saying like, why do you shop at the dollar store, you're being unhealthy, let's
right.
think of healthy options. Like that's not the freaking solution. Like
That's
that's
not
not how we should be having these conversations. But like that's an interest, yeah, it's an interesting distinction. It's just how historic power and food has always been,
yeah.
and food as a means of control.
Yeah, and even so far as like, this is healthy food and this is not healthy food. Like, I mean, we can use data to say that, but there's a part that talks about culture and tradition, and I think I wrote it down. It's in Article 4 that, um what is that called? Because that's a really, really good one. Blackness and Justice in the Los Angeles Food Justice Movement, sorry. That is more of a like commentary based article. The other ones are it felt more personal. She told a personal story during the article about how she decided to like be a part of an organization, and they asked her a question about like what foods they eat, what her favorite food is. And she was a mentor, and she said her favorite food was mac and cheese. And that based on everybody else's answers, there's like a big Latinx community and the white community and Black community. Like everybody was represented, everybody in the Los Angeles like space, and Indigenous and also Indian community. Like everybody said a traditional food, and then she said mac and cheese. And afterwards, another organizer was like, don't say that again, because we want to teach people how to eat healthy food. And it removed this cultural identification that, and then now, so that we just think of Black food as unhealthy food.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we're at this place of like, what you're doing is wrong, and here's the actual solution, because that's not healthy. But like, it just actually adds to this, like, removed the culture, you're just Black, like you're just, you don't get to have a culture that is your own anymore conversation, and how important culture and food are together, and how when you remove that, something like mac and cheese, it's seen as unhealthy and shameful. But like, they could talk about tamales and like all of these other culturally maybe not as healthy foods, but like they're very culturally related. It just seemed so, and I never really thought about it. um how, yeah, like mac and cheese, like what is that, a cultural food? Is it an American food? Like that's just one example that she gave, but I mean it is.
Mm-hmm.
But
But a lot of those foods that are ingrained in African American culture come from the days of slavery, where
totally,
where the like any they were using anything that they could find in order to feed their community around them.
yep,
And so like big one pot meals were a thing.
yeah, and
And
they're still
cheap,
a huge part of Black culture and Black
yeah.
food culture.
Yeah, barbecue, yeah, a lot of that'll
And
be
that
something
is
I talk
so
about.
important. Yeah, I'm really excited to listen to you talk about the barbecue article, because that one looked really cool. But it's like, yeah, we think of
Mhm.
soul food as the traditional Black food, but that only makes sense if you view it through like the idea of white colonial oppressive ideas in an urban environment, actually, because also if you think about it in terms of like the times of slavery, it was entirely agricultural. Like Black folks have been working on and with community and with gardens and feeding whole huge groups of people and feeding this country since the beginning of this country. And a lot of that comes from Africa, and a lot of like the way even we preserve now is still rooted in an African culture. And they've always found ways to feed themselves and to feed their communities, even when they other people were, or white folks were, using food as a punishment or
Mhm.
as like a privilege or like with power.
Mhm.
They still, that's the term, finding ways where there are no ways, or where there is no ways. And which I think is so incredible. And this book, like, just it takes you there, it takes you to that feeling. And oh, and it feels, it offers a sense of pride as to of like, from the authors, of like, holy shit, we did it, kind of a feeling. There's like these communities, they still prosper, and they still, and they're learning and gaining a voice. And through all of this hardship, which is shown so clearly in food culture, it like really makes me so emotional. It's such a beautiful thing to try to understand and to try to empathize with. And when I think about it, so then I like took a step back and spent it like and thought about it in terms of sustainability, because I also want to always think about from our lens of like sustainability and environmentalism. A community that makes ways where there are no ways is a community that we should be spending time learning from, because we're moving in that direction. When we have the idea and the power of food sovereignty as a given thing is such a privilege that we have that we never even think about, because as white folks, we just have had it. We just have it. It's just, we can just assume that we have the power to make eating decisions. And from a community that hasn't always had that power and that has had to fight to gain it and work really hard to like have a voice in their food system, we should be looking at that as a learning example, because we're rapidly approaching a situation where we are not going to be food sovereign if we don't change our ways and find new ways.
Yeah.
I just love it. I love this book. And yeah, that's pretty much the first half. Just like my
your takeaways. Yeah.
Takeaways from this first part.
Yeah, it is. That's so, I mean, you mentioned that in one part of this book that they sort of mentioned other solutions that aren't like a food bank or something to that extent. Like, in my section, they actively said like we don't have any solutions for some of these issues. This is just a continuous thing that continues to happen, and they really just were trying to kind of raise awareness.
So what I found really interesting, and by solutions I meant kind of a different way of looking at it. One of my, in article 1, she talks about entrepreneurship in food culture, and I think that like entrepreneurship in food culture compared to like the Black Panther programs, like in one, they're both feeding people. In the entrepreneurship, it's like you have a food truck. You know, she talks a lot about like food trucks, and they're mobile. They make food available to whole communities. They can be where the community will be, and they can be cheaper because they don't cost as much, although it's really expensive to have a food truck politically, because there are a bunch of like politics around food trucks, and they negatively impact Black entrepreneurs more, which is, and
that's interesting.
Yeah, it didn't go really deep into that, but it was sort of like how new policies that are coming out negatively impact the entrepreneurs that are feeding that parts, whether it's just like they get priced out, or there's like new areas where they can't really be, or like the types of food that they had, like they just make it harder. They put up roadblocks.
Restaurant owners are super anti-food truck. Yeah.
Which I think is so silly.
It is. There's enough people that need food and are hungry.
Need food, guys.
It's fine.
Yeah. So that's
Hmm.
but she talks a lot about food trucks and the entrepreneurialism and how like showing up for the community in this altruistic way, um, and how that is often not calculated in the census about food access, and or it's calculated as fast food or unhealthy food, but then you go back into that
Let's see.
unhealthy food conversation. What I find really interesting is sort of like looking at the food truck entrepreneurs in these lower income areas, and also hucksters from the past, which hucksters is like basically a food truck that drives through with fresh fruits and vegetables. And it
Hmm.
used to be really common, and then now it's not as common.
Yeah.
Um, but these types of solutions, these entrepreneurial types of solutions, are great. I think that they're really helpful because yeah, you can take the farmers market through, or you can offer a culturally balanced cultural food that's a balanced meal outside of the school. You know, those
Hmm.
types of entrepreneurialism.
So cool. Can you
They
imagine? Can you imagine like an actual like a fresh food truck that would drive around like an ice cream truck where you could get your
that would
like
be super
organic
cool.
veggies? Like what? That would be incredible.
Yeah, it's not. That's not a new idea.
It's not a new idea, right?
It's just the thing that people like used to drive their horses through, and then you'd buy, but they got banned.
They got banned from racist policies so that larger grocery store chains could come in and
Yeah,
take their place.
capitalism.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly that. So that's
Mhm.
one really cool solution I loved. But I'm also thinking about it like juxtaposed like this like actual food solution with the other actual food solution from the Black Panther program. And like politically it's harder, sure, for the food trucks, but it's viable. It's a viable solution. And I say that because again, like black folks in groups that are educated really scare the white folks in power. So you start to see these like entrepreneurial things that come through, and they're like solo, they're not groups. It's just like the solution. But and it's still a small, it's still activism. It is still this like small act of rebellion, but it is a solitary act of rebellion, which I think is a little less scary. It goes a little bit more under the radar and makes things a little more possible in this like weird political world that we have to navigate to also try to help solve issues like this.
Mhm.
So that was a solution. They
Interesting.
also, in the last, uh, I didn't take a bunch of, I took notes on it, but I didn't put it into my thought space. In the last one, uh, good food in a racist system, they talked about, I wrote it down. So I want to say it right. Social enterprise versus social justice.
Hmm.
Did you read about that
No.
one?
No.
Okay, it's a big part. So there's another article about Detroit. So
Must have been. Yeah.
yeah. Um, it's like having a community garden, and then like urban agriculture is something they called out specifically in this book, which we've talked about is like could be helpful but has to be really intentionally solving this problem. In the first article there's a really cool example of these independent gardeners that just rent big plots of land, and then they just leave their gate open. If somebody's hungry they can come eat something, but it's a community. So that's the social justice way. That's the like small act of solo rebellion kind of way. But then there's this like social enterprise way, which is another way of like, which isn't super racially charged, but it's like capitalist, classist charged of like, I'm going to start an urban farm and then everybody can eat from my urban farm if they buy it. So it's like they can't afford, then they're priced out of the urban agriculture, and they like the urban ag is like, we have to make money. And she talks about buying a pound of spinach. The woman that they interviewed talked about buying a pound of spinach for $3. Like, have you ever cooked down a pound of spinach? It's like this much. Like, what the fuck is that? Who the fuck are you feeding? Like, it's still, that is a social enterprise. That is like where the urban agriculture is like, we still have to make money. If it's for the money, it's not social justice, it's social entrepreneurship. And that doesn't help. That is just like a neoliberal idea about food and social entrepreneurship and trying to like find a solution to a problem. It's like buy a solution. It's still a capitalist plan. It doesn't help the community. Just to have a garden, you have to like buy a bunch of stuff from it that is super expensive, you know?
Right. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. Huh. That's never been my impression, I suppose, of like when talking about the solution of a community garden. It's never been like, oh yeah, the community garden is run by someone and you still have to buy all of your produce from it at like Whole Foods prices.
Yeah.
That's interesting that exists, though. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, the community garden is I agree with you. The community garden in my mind is the social justice part, but like the urban agricultural co-op or like the the business that is an urban ag is the social enterprise. If that makes sense, does that distinction make sense? It's such a gray thing to try to distinguish.
Yeah, and I suppose without seeing it like sort of in practice, they're both active farms in urban areas, one of which just is sort of operating more like a nonprofit where it just sort of people donate their time and so maybe based on the time you donate, you also kind of can get access to the crops.
Yeah.
But then this other one is this social enterprise is just sort of like a store. Like people can just
Basically,
go
it's a
to the
farm,
they just go to the
store.
farm.
Yeah.
It's like a farm stand kind of thing. They just purchase things, but it's not actually helping with access at
It doesn't.
all.
No, because
If the
distance
price,
shouldn't be an issue
yeah,
for people living in these
yeah.
places.
Right. Like you mentioned with Detroit, like, yeah, it doesn't matter if somebody's going 2 miles, 4 miles, they're still in their car. It doesn't make a huge difference.
Right. Or it's just something they're used to, or it's, it's a normalized situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So it's actually like, yeah, the pricing someone out of the of the potential solution to food access is just as much of a problem as
Yeah.
not even having a farm in there in the first place.
Yeah.
That just seems like it's like a ego. You just want to seem like you're doing something virtuous.
And thusly, it is a social enterprise. That's exactly
Yes.
the point.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
That's not a phrase I've ever heard.
Me either. I really liked it. And then they start talking about like Whole Foods, because Whole Foods opened in Detroit. It was a really big deal. And because Whole Foods opened in Detroit and it was one of the first big chains that had been in Detroit for like 10 years or something, because Detroit has a bunch of little markets, but it didn't have any like big markets that weren't in the suburbs around Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, this is food is such a gray area. People were like, fuck Whole Foods, like, what are they doing here? But there were a lot of other people that were like, actually, it's not that bad. Like, you can go to 365. Like, now it's been there a while, and they offer classes, they give feedback events, they offer cooking stuff and how to do detox. Like, they take an active role in the community as a Whole Foods market. And that has shifted the way people interact with Whole Foods as a grocery store in Detroit. So there wasn't really a commentary whether or not it's like positive or negative. It was more about like if it was moral or immoral, and sort of the like philosophy behind the morality, like social enterprise versus social justice. It's like, well, Whole Foods prices people out pretty quickly as a, you know, it's expensive to create food that is really, really like healthy, organic, non-GMO, like, you know, with good meat, like
Yeah.
all that's expensive to produce. It's really expensive to buy. But they put a stand in, and they put a store in Detroit, and then they took an active part in the community of teaching the community about healthy food and how to feed their family, how to feed their community, and make their bodies more healthy. And
so it's more of like a hybrid kind of those two concepts of the
yeah,
social justice and social enterprise. Yeah. Where
yeah, and that seems cool. Like the people, they interviewed a few people about it, and some were like, I don't shop there because it's too expensive, and other people were like, I don't really shop there, but I have taken their classes. I do understand healthy food a lot better. I understand how to feed my body, like what to look for when I go. Like the education piece is so important here, because even that gets back to this like Black Panther program of educating, feeding, politicizing the community to organize.
That's great. I mean, yeah, I hope that they're giving jobs to the people that actually work there. Great. Or that live there.
Yeah, they teach the community members. It's like it actually seems like a pretty cool program, and I think that like that's what Whole Foods should be doing. Like
absolutely should be doing. Yeah. Whole Foods has so much resources. Like they have, yeah, I mean, they're huge now and have been for many years. And it's yeah, that's something where they can really, you know, put their money where their mouth is. Is that too much of a pun for talking about food? I don't know. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, it's like it makes total sense. Yeah. It's like the Apple Store teaching seniors how to use cell phones and like, here's how you use your calculator. Like, it's like,
yeah,
that's like, you can't just skip over and just say like, why aren't you eating healthy? Why aren't you buying all of these whole foods? But it's like, you're completely skipping the whole like education.
Why is it important?
Piece. Yeah. What? Like, I don't know how to make a stew. I don't know. Like, yeah. And then once you do, you're like, great, I could take that valuable knowledge and go and search for, you know, perhaps the types of foods or the price bracket of foods that works for me, you know.
Yeah. Super cool. This, man, I could think about just these chapters of this book for a long time. I mean, yeah, people spend their whole lives studying the actual ways to make a difference. And just the idea that like it's also so refreshing to read from the point of view of like of the Black food culture, to like see the interviews and kind of have a better understanding of what's actually going on, what's actually helpful, what's the true history of the Black Panthers written from the point of view of them. It's so nice. This is it's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, the way this country treated the Black Panther Party is really disgusting and awful. Yeah.
Pretty embarrassing. You should be embarrassed about that.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, gosh, thank you for sharing those bits from the first half. That was really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is an awesome book, and
I'm excited to hear your
yeah, so part 2, stay tuned, everybody. Yeah, we're going to be talking about it's interesting because the second half is quite different. It really kind of goes over a lot about cultural appropriation with food.
Ooh.
Yeah. And also a pretty big piece of legislation with the USDA actually being sued for some racist activity, which is interesting. I didn't know, never heard of this. So
Cliffhanger. Let's do a deep dive on that one for our BD. I want to know more.
yeah, so stay tuned for that if you want to learn more about this further ways in which capitalist post-colonial racism still hanging on in our everyday world.
Sure is.
Yes. But thanks for watching this episode, guys.
See you next time.
I feel